Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. So wonderful to see you here today. Look at this wonderful crowd. I'd like to start, of course, by acknowledging the Darkinjung people and the Gurungai people, the traditional custodians of the land on which we are gathered today, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and of course, extend that respect to any First Nations peoples who may be joining us today. And to say welcome to all of you. Thank you for being at Words on the Waves, and thank you to Words on the Waves for having us. This is such a delight. I am so excited about this panel. So, as you've likely read in the program, each of these speakers has hit rock bottom, but managed to build something positive from the rubble. What a description that is. Together, we're here to consider trauma, masculinity, neuroplasticity, and the chance to start over. So I'm going to introduce each of these men in order, but first I'll just tell you a bit more about myself. I am the author of the best-selling psychological thriller Dark Mode, so if you are a crime reader, I wrote that book for you. And it's not officially announced yet, but we're all friends here. So my next thriller is coming out in February next year, and it is called Cold Truth. Thank you. But before that, I wrote a memoir about moving from Canada to Australia and facing a crisis of identity and belonging. And my earlier work, My Name is Revenge, is about my family's survival of the Armenian genocide and the legacy of trauma that was passed down through the generations to me. And in case that wasn't enough to, earn me my place on this panelist chair, I spent 2 years bedridden, and for a good chunk of that time I was functionally illiterate. And so for that reason, it is incredibly meaningful for me to be here today, and a real honor to get to speak with each of these writers, who I will now introduce. On my far right, career policeman Craig Semple experienced a severe episode of PTSD, which triggered a turn to mental health advocacy. Craig was a career detective in the New South Wales Police Force for 25 years. Medically retired from law enforcement in 2013, Craig is now a sought-after speaker on mental health and well-being. And today we're discussing his memoir, The Cop Who Fell to Earth. Absolutely incredible book, as all three of them are. In the middle, we've got Gregory Smith, a former forest recluse. For him, a light bulb moment on a park bench transformed a life of homelessness and addiction into academia and contentment. Gregory is one of Australia's foremost lived experience experts in post-traumatic stress disorder, mental illness, domestic violence, alcohol and drug addiction, rough sleeping, and homelessness. His memoir, Out of the Forest, came out in 2018, and today we're discussing his most recent book, Better Than Happiness, both of which are available in the bookshop. And for Ben McKelvey, it took a stroke and a heart attack to force him to assess his trauma and remake himself. Ben is an author, journalist, and editor, and his books have won multiple awards, including Australian Independent Book Award for nonfiction. So please welcome all three of our speakers. And I'll remind you now that all of their books are available. They will be available for signing afterwards if you would like to have the chance to meet them. And all of their books would make excellent gifts for anyone you need a gift for. Seriously. All right. So, in my experience of reading these three memoirs, what really connects them is the concept of neuroplasticity, the way our minds develop new neural pathways, whether those are constructive or maladaptive. So I'd like to start by having Ben introduce the concept of neuroplasticity because he has written about it in his work, A Scar is Also Skin. So Ben, can you tell us about this concept?
I can, in a very non-scientific kind of way, because that is how I understand it. And that's how I think most people understand it, because the mechanism of neuroplasticity isn't something that's necessarily well understood from a scientific perspective, but it is something that's understood from a perceptive point of view. So the example in my book is my experience of having a stroke when I was quite young, with Steve Dibden, who's just over there, who's just walked into the room, as someone who was with me in that period. I had a stroke, and then there was brain damage, and there was permanent brain damage, as it is with strokes. And so my brain had to adapt for the environment that I was going to find myself in. So that basically is what neuroplasticity is. Neuroplasticity is you are in an environment, you have a brain, your brain has to try to adapt to that environment. The way that it happens for most of us is it happens when you're quite young, and there are these periods where you have these sort of neuronal surpluses, and they're in your brain and they're ready to be adapted to a certain process. Language is one of those sorts of things. So you are really good at learning a new language or a new skill when you're young and when you're adolescent, because you have these sort of this overburden of neurons, and then that all sort of sheds away. But it's a process that continues through your life. So when you find yourself in a new environment, which doesn't necessarily mean a physical environment, it could be an emotional environment as well, your brain will slowly adapt to that environment. And that's a psychological and physiological process, which, I mean, the two are kind of the same thing anyway. I found while I was researching that book. Yeah. So that's basically what it is. It's if you're in a new relationship, if you have a young child, if you go to another country, whatever it is, as your life is changing, your brain is changing, and that's neuroplasticity.
Thank you so much. And that process, as you said, continues throughout your life. And I want to now go to Craig. In terms of what we just talked about in terms of neuroplasticity, can you start off by telling us about your early years in policing and as a young father and husband? Now, you note that at that time in your life, you thought you had everything worked out, but also that you dealt with the most confronting parts of policing by focusing on the job at hand and shutting down any emotional reactions. So tell us about that time in your life and maybe how that was affecting your neural pathways.
Yeah, look, a lot of what Ben said relates to me insofar as a young bloke before I joined the police force, I wasn't a tough guy. Even when I was bullied at school or anything like that, I'd rather run from trouble than run towards it. But here I was when I joined the police force. I actually started my career at Redfern back in the 80s and 90s. It was a pretty tough place to work. And throughout my whole career, I worked in high-octane jobs. Like I did a lot of work in in the field of drug work, a lot of outlaw motorcycle gang work and homicides. And I guess neuroplasticity for me, my brain eventually over time became really hardwired for danger, and my default system was basically was never rest and digest. It was always hypervigilance, always looking for something bad to happen, scanning crowds. All those sort of things got hardwired into my brain over time, and my body as well. There's the neuroplasticity just is not just a psychological thing; it's also a physical thing as well. And then when I ended up out of the police force, I had I had mental health problems for quite a while particularly after one particular homicide. And I basically just threw myself into my work to try to avoid it, used a lot of alcohol and things like that, and eventually burnt myself out. That was what ended my career, burnout really, at the end of the day, and had a 3-year battle with significant depression and PTSD. But basically what happened for me, like as far as rewiring my brain through that neuroplasticity, was putting some strategies into my life, like exercise and meditation was a massive one, practicing gratitude, so that over time I rewired my brain so you wire it and you can unwire it as well. I rewired it for me to start to see the world as not a dangerous place and not full of bad people. Cops become quite cynical over time because of what you're faced with on a daily basis. And it's one of the big things I deal with police that are leaving the police force now, with the same sort of battles that I had with the programs I run, is teaching them about neuroplasticity so they can understand you don't have to be in this state for the rest of your life. You can actually wind it back and then get back to having, if not a better life than what you had even before you joined.
Amazing. Thank you so much. We're going to get into so many more details around that, but that's a great overview of the book and of your experience. All right, Gregory, let's talk about your brain. Your story is extraordinary, and there's just so much I want to ask you about. So you grew up facing just appalling abuse, both at home and then in an orphanage, became an addict, ended up experiencing homelessness, and eventually just rejected society altogether, living in the forest as a hermit for a decade. And not in this kind of idealistic sense either, but in a sense of really struggling, to reject any human contact, and B, of course, you were still an alcoholic, so that you weren't in the forest in this sort of ideal embracing nature sense, I would say, although there was some of that. But you then returned to society in your 40s, and while still homeless, essentially one day just decided that you were going to change, that you were going to change yourself and you were going to change your life. And over time, utterly transformed. And as a result, are here today. And I want to get into that light bulb moment on the park bench, but just first, how does it feel being in this room right now?
I'm alive. How does it feel being in this room right now? It's an honour, and I'm quite humbled that people are interested in what I have to say. We all have stories, and if people want to sit around and listen to you tell your story, I think that's the greatest privilege a community can actually ask of you.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And I know you've been in a lot of rooms like this at this point in your life. This isn't your first one, but looking back to your younger life, could you have ever predicted something like this?
In my younger life, look, I would have been just grateful having a bed to sleep in, to be honest. Having someone to talk to, anyone to talk to. I know that loneliness is an incredibly frigid way of closing down your mind and just narrowing your thinking processes and hardening your heart. So just being able to talk to people is a. I was actually taught that as a child in institutions. To talk to other people was actually considered to be a privilege. Because I was often unprivileged, and when I was unprivileged, I was never allowed to talk to people. So talking's a privilege.
Yeah, wow. All right, tell us about the light bulb moment on the park bench. This is after your 10 years in the forest. You're still experiencing homelessness, living on the sand dunes at Byron Bay. What was that light bulb moment for you? Okay,
I guess without going into too much depth, the key point of that discussion is to understand that some months prior to that, two things had happened. Firstly, I'd lost an argument with some aliens. So my penalty for losing that argument was that I had to reintroduce myself to society. There's always conditions. So if you ever get into an argument, just always read the fine print. The second part of that was that as I exited the forest, I was hit by a car and ended up in hospital. That was important because what happened there is the social workers at the hospital, the psychologists, established my identity because I didn't know who I was. I had got to a point where I had no idea who I was. So that was the other really important moment. And they put me on a disability support pension, which was kind of really weird because all of a sudden I had all this money. And they back paid me for 3 months, which was a lot of money, And for a homeless alcoholic addict, and you got all this money, what are you going to do? So I went out, bought a new backpack and a whole lot of essential supplies, bourbon, tobacco, cocaine, a few other things. I'm sitting on a park bench and it's a nice sunny day. It was the back of the Tweedheads Hospital. If you've ever been out there, it's beautiful country. It's amazingly beautiful country. And there's this beautiful big river. It's all peaceful. The fish are jumping. I'm sitting there thinking, this is beautiful. After spending 10 years in a forest and I'm looking out at the ocean. And all of a sudden I thought, if I just had one person that I could tell all my problems to, I might be okay. That's not a good thought for the loneliest man in the world. Because all of a sudden, I went inside myself. And I remember when I was just a child, and if you reflect back on your childhood and you had this passion for life, and it's like a raging fire in your gut. And the day I sat there on that park bench, I just wanted to reach inside of me and put that fire out. And in that moment, I realised, I had an epiphany, and I realised that, you know, I was standing on the battlefield of life, and it was just devastation. But the most important thing is I realised that I'd caused all this devastation fighting myself. All my life I'd been fighting myself. All my life I'd been the creator of all my problems. Now, that is quite a profound moment in life, to understand that. And to understand that at such a deep level that you actually decide to do something about it. The interesting thing about that, it only takes a moment to make a decision, a fraction of a second to make a decision. But in that moment can create another life's work. So you spend the rest of your life trying to live up to that decision. And for me, it meant becoming a different person. I couldn't rebuild the same person because I didn't understand what a good person was. I'd never had that experience. So I had to dream the dreams of being a good person. And what did that look like? I had no heroes, I had no role models. All I had was fairy tales. And I used to see people as fairy tales, trolls, angels or devils. And so I chose to walk with the angels.
Incredible. And this is what I mean about choosing, like very specifically choosing to rewire your brain in a whole new way. It's really extraordinary. Ben, you describe in detail in the early chapters of your book about the physical experience of having a stroke, and in particular how it affected your capacity for language. And you were working as a writer at that time. What was that experience like?
The way I describe it is it being disconnecting. It was the loneliest experience, and it was after the stroke I realised, you know, just how integral language and communication is with an actual tether that we have with the world and the people around us. So after I had the stroke, in the immediate aftermath of the stroke, I couldn't speak and couldn't understand language. And then a few days later, I could understand language, but I was confused by it. And then a few months later, I started to be able to write again. And so all of that was sort of slowly, that stuff had to be slowly built back up again. But the thing that had bothered me the most was I was in a room where everybody felt that I was part of the environment, part of the communication network, you know, the whole sort of thing, but I was so distant from it. You know, it was a little bit like last night I went out with some friends and we're in a restaurant. The restaurant was busy and it was quite noisy, and they were talking to me, but I couldn't really hear a lot of things that were being said, and you sort of nod and smile, and I was like, oh, that was exactly what it was like for me, you know, because I had this distanced experience for quite a long time. And I was a writer then, but I wasn't the type of writer that I am now. You know, then I was a pretty cynical writer. You know, I was working on a magazine and nothing that I wrote really connected with my emotional life. But it was afterwards, I think it was because I had that arm's length experience, that then I was like, oh, I think I can actually see a model of the way that the connection between two people work. You know, so then I applied that to my writing, and it was only after the stroke that I actually sort of became a writer of work that I was really proud of. So yeah, disconnection, I would say, was the most significant feeling.
And I actually want to build on that because I have another question related to that. And this is something that, I mean, really, really struck me as someone who's lived with significant illness for so long. But you pose the question in your book of disconnection as an emotion. And you describe, like, when you were in the hospital in your 20s and knowing your friends and colleagues, you know, you're in hospital with this kind of uncertain future, uncertain situation. Your friends and colleagues and family are all just moving on with their lives. Like, their lives have not been interrupted. So can you just describe a little bit more about that feeling and just how that affected you?
Yeah, I mean, it affected me in a bad way, and then I think it actually affected me in a good way as well, because the comparison that I use in the book is what it was like when you were sick from school when you were at primary school. So everything is ticking along the way that it should, and they have these natural rhythms of the way that life works. You have Monday to Friday, you go to school, you have after school, there's this kind of like on rails experience of what it is to go through the school week. And then all of a sudden, the whole thing is derailed, and the postman's still coming, and you hear that people are going to school and all this sort of stuff. But you're in the room, and you're just like, oh, there's another way of living. Things happen in my house when I'm at school. It's like, it's so strange. And then to have that experience in your 20s, when you're like, you have this set of assumptions as to what your life is going to be like, and you're like, everybody keeps going with the inertia of their life. You stop yours. I thought my career was over as well, which I hadn't really thought that much about my career, but I was like, oh, all these assumptions that I had, then they're all wrecked. And in the book, I actually went back and looked at some experiences that people had had that I'd written about, and these were people who'd had significant trauma experiences. And when people have childhood trauma experiences, there are lots of things that can happen to them, but it's much more likely that they're going to experience criminality, but they're also much more likely to do something that's brilliant with their life. Childhood trauma is linked with creating a patent, getting an Oscar, all these sorts of things that can happen. And I think it is because you have that experience of life ticking along the way that it should be, and you have these set of assumptions about life, and then the whole thing is ruined, and then it's like, oh, there's a new path. It might be bad, it might be good, but there is a new path and you can take it that some people who haven't had these experiences perhaps can't.
I was so engaged in that response that I didn't even look at my next question. That's just, yeah, having had that experience and still today, dealing with ongoing illness and that uncertainty, I completely relate to everything that you're saying. Craig, as a cop, you dealt with a huge variety of traumas, from physical attacks to gruesome deaths to the near loss of your brother during his own work as a police officer. One thing I really commend you for in your book is that you don't shy away from sharing some of those experiences, and not that they're gratuitous in any way, but you just state the facts of what your working life was, and I think that's really, really valuable. I'd like to hear a bit more about how you were coping as the years went by, and get a bit more into how alcohol factored in.
Yeah, well, look, how I was coping, surviving probably in the long run. Look, the police force I joined back in 1988 was well before the Royal Commission into Police Corruption in New South Wales, and as you can imagine, it was to describe our culture back then as being loose would be an understatement. But with that went drinking. Drinking, we had no psychological services back then. And even when they did introduce them throughout the course of my career, it was sort of a little bit too late for a lot of us. We'd already got stuck and embedded in the way we were dealing with trauma and the things we would deal with. So alcohol, for me at the start of my career, was mainly to maybe enhance the social aspects of the job because it was fun. But as time went on, it became more of a crutch, more to support me, help escape at the end of a shift, numb me out, help me get to sleep as well. So alcohol was a massive part of it. And look, alcohol's a depressant, and over time, it's along with chronic lack of sleep. For last 8 or 9 years of my career, a good night sleep for me was 5 hours, but mostly it was 2 or 3 hours a night, and that's not sustainable. Bad nightmares and stuff like that didn't help. But so alcohol was a massive part of it. But my main coping strategy, believe it or not, was just chasing the excitement and thrills of what my job offered me. Working on bikie gangs and doing the drug work we were doing was pretty high risk, and it was basically the way I did it was intentionally loading myself up with massive levels of stress. And it was, I'd pick a target and pick a job. We'd work it down over 6 or 7 months, maybe a year, the long ones, and then we'd get a win at the end. And it was great, flying high on that euphoria of a big win, but then I'd be looking for the next big job and the next big one. And it was sort of like a manic defence as a way to try to outrun what I felt was nipping at my heels, was just to keep running hard. And the way I talk about mental health now with particularly with men in a lot of mining, construction, those sort of industries, you can run as hard and fast as you like from mental health problems but at the end of the day, the harder you run, the faster you run, the harder you get pulled down in the end, and that's eventually what happened to me.
Thank you. Would you be willing to read one paragraph from your book for us?
Yeah, I wasn't ready for that, but okay.
I should have.
I haven't got my glasses. That got me out of it.
I should have prepped you for this. I didn't. But page 128, just the first paragraph of your book.
I haven't got my glasses, actually.
Oh,
I left
okay.
them in the
regular
magnifying,
that'll
do.
Your book's. Oh yeah, here. Page 128.
It's good to see they're it's about as clean as mine as well. So.
I'm with my DNA too. That's great.
128. What paragraph was it?
Just that top, the first paragraph.
Nah, they're not strong enough, mate. Seriously.
Oh.
Who
okay.
else has got some? Who's got doubles?
I was gonna say I can read it.
Ooh.
No. The bad job as a chair, everyone. We'll just try everyone's glasses.
No, they're good.
Oh, there we go. Thank you.
Yeah, Greg's glasses were going to make me travel sick, I think. All right. So a couple of days later, for the very first time in my life, I booked an appointment with a psychologist. It was a big move and my first real admission that I had a problem. We didn't get far during that initial consultation, and I didn't return. Looking back, I just didn't feel like the clinician would be a good fit for me. There was no way I was going to talk about shit I didn't want to talk about or let career-ending secrets out of the bag with someone who I didn't think would get it. Afterwards, I didn't tell anyone about the appointment, not even my wife. I kept it secret. I was embarrassed and terrified of the consequences for my career. I decided that I just had to harden up a bit more and try to stay out of trouble. That mainly keep going, or do you want to do a bit more?
Just that top paragraph.
One morning, after lying awake most of the night, I told Wendy that I was having nightmares. I told her that they were about the murders I had seen and were bad. Her lack of reaction demonstrated that she didn't understand, and to be quite honest, I was kind of relieved. I thought to myself, no one dies of nightmares, so just get to work, don't ever tell another soul.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you for the glasses. I felt like that paragraph really summed up that point you were at and that you were describing, but I also thought it was so interesting that you did try and seek help at that point, but it just didn't work for you. But later on in the book, you were advised that, had you actually gotten proper help sooner, you probably could have kept on with your career for a lot longer.
Yeah, it was a big moment for me. I ended up spending 3 months doing some pretty intense work at a trauma clinic at Westmead Hospital, and they did 2 days of assessments on me to see whether they were going to take me on the program. And at the end of the second day, I looked at the doctor, Lucy, and I had this burning question. I said to her, Lucy, my problem started 8 or 9 years ago when I first started having nightmares. Now, if I'd have got help back then, before all the other problems started to creep into my life and cause all the dramas, would it have really made a difference? And she looked at me and said, Craig, if you had done that, we could have had this all sorted out with about 5 one-hour sessions. That's all it would have taken. A few little things they do, exposure therapy, other things. They would have looked after me through the rest of my career. Still would have been in the job that I love so much. My marriage still would have been together and everything else that went with it as well. So it's one of my main messages with mental health and the work I do now is I don't regret much in my life. I think life's too short for regrets, and I choose to draw a line in the sand and make peace with the things that I've done that I'm not proud of and move on. But probably one thing I'd change if I had a chance was go back and take those 5 sessions.
And this is what I mean. All 3 of these books, there are so many profound moments like that and profound insights. I just found them incredible. Gregory challenged me to see if I could ask him a question that he hasn't been asked before. So maybe this one. So in some of what you describe in terms of changing your thinking, I was wondering if looking back, you think some of that could have been the benefit of age, because that moment you described on the park bench, you were in your early 40s at that time. So I'm wondering if circumstances had been different, Could you have gone through such a radical transformation earlier in your life, or did you need to reach your 40s to really begin contemplating the possibility of contentment?
Everything is exactly as it is meant to be, right here, right now. My challenge, should I choose to accept it, is just merely accept it. And that is the key for me, just accepting. And that's what I did not do when I was young. I did not accept my situations. I did not accept where I was. I did not accept that children should be seen and not heard. I did not accept that children should be locked up in cells. I did not accept. And that just created a whole lot of conflict for me. Today, does age play a part in it? Yes, I think it does. And I have no regrets. I have no regrets. I have a young son. I have a beautiful family. I want for nothing. When you're locked in a cupboard under the stairs, and you're terrified of the dark, and you're terrified of that flogging that you're going to get when you come out, you try and find a little space for your mind. I don't have to do that anymore. So today's a beautiful day.
Wonderful. And it was really wonderful seeing you with your son in the green room prior to our panel. Gregory was holding his son, and his son had his hands, and just like wrapping his hands through his hair, and just very happily spending time together. It was beautiful. Ben, another commonality on this panel is not great fathers. Gregory's father was violent. Craig's was very unloving and ended up committing a criminal offense. Ben, your father simply left your family without a word to anyone. Now, you were older at that time.
Well,
that's what I mean.
yeah, you're like, not great fathers. I was like, I love my father. My father was great. The book is...
Until he just left without a word to you.
Well, yeah, which I understand because that's the way we did things in our family.
Interesting.
So at the time, I wasn't like, I can't believe he left without a word.
Yeah,
I'm
right.
like, yeah, well, that makes sense. A few weeks later when we realised that he wasn't coming back. But, I was 19 at that point.
Yes.
So we had an adult relationship. I mean, obviously there was a lot of anger and resentment and things like that. But as you read in the book, Dad was on the streets himself. He had his own troubles. So yeah, I mean, I think it's because he died relatively recently. So I forgive and understand the things that he did and the choices that he made. Yeah,
well, and that's what I wanted to ask you about. Was your father coming back into your life when you were in hospital, and as you described, and then the book opening with him present in your life? So can you tell us a bit more about that? Yeah, I mean, the book, when I started writing the book, this was a book that I was contracted to do for many years before I actually sat down and wrote it. The reason why it took me so long was because I had these sort of inauthentic, tin-eared experiences of reading back my pages and going, oh, this is not right. This is bad writing, or this doesn't represent a person that feels real. And my first attempts were actually before I had written any other books, and then I wrote a series of ghost-written books for people. About people who were so drastically different to me. I don't know whether any of you read Songs of a War Boy. I ghost wrote that book for Deng Aduit. Love that book.
So I did Archie Roach's book as well, Tell Me Why. So these were books that I'd written for people whose experiences were so drastically different to mine. And I kept trying to go back to mine in my voice, and it wasn't right, and it wasn't right. And then Dad got really sick, and I knew that he wasn't going to live, and I became a father. So those things happened at the same time, and I knew that he was giving me some papers that he had written. And as I said, in our family, we didn't share in the way that is healthy necessarily. But I knew that he was going to give me his memoirs, and I was like, well, I don't want to do that. I want my daughter to know me. I also knew that I had been in a precarious medical situation and continue to be, as we all are, with the sort of Damocles hanging over us at all times. So I was like, I want to write right now. So that's why I sat down and started writing it. So he was the impetus, and the other reason why that he's related to me writing that book is, I think he would have loved to have been a writer. I think that's something that he really would have respected. Whether he respected the books that I did, I mean, I think he was proud, but he did love to send me text messages saying, "Have you read Ian McEwan's new book?" And I'd be like, "Yeah, I have." He's like, "Can you imagine writing that well?" And I'm like, "No, I can't."
Wow. All right. Craig, you visited a gang member named Sierra. This is someone you write a lot about in the book. You spent a long time working to put this man behind bars. And so you have this moment in the book where you see him behind bars, and in this very non-confrontational way, like just statement of fact way, he says, "You and me are the exact same age, and you look terrible. You look so stressed and so aged. Your job is killing you." Not long after that, you finally started admitting to yourself and your colleagues how much you were struggling. So what happened? What happened next?
Yeah, look, it's one of those things too with that particular gangster. He was a sergeant at arms of a motorcycle gang I was working on. So when sergeant at arms is like an enforcer, so he's a tough bloke, and basically he and I were criminal opposites. So I was on my side of the fence, he was his. But one thing, I've talked about this, everyone heard of Gary Jubilin with the I Catch Killers, and I did some podcast work with Gary, and we talked a lot about how with some criminals, like some of them are just like really bad, and you just got no time for them. Others, we're talking about taking different pathways in life. You just don't know what people's backgrounds are and what choices they ended up having to make. But one thing with this bloke, he always respected me, at least, which was good. And when he said that, when he made that observation to me, it was only a couple of weeks before I eventually had a big breakdown. And it wasn't said with any malice or cheek. It was genuine care, believe it or not, which was incredible. What really hit me was, out of all my workmates and family, the only person who really noticed was my criminal opposite number. So but that was pretty spectacular. But then, look, it was only a couple of weeks later. It wasn't really my choice to go and get the help. I basically pushed myself to the point where I was hit over the head with it, and I had such a sudden catastrophic mental breakdown, I called it then. These days, though, I call it a breakthrough. It probably needed to happen, right? So, but it was so catastrophic, I had no choice. I was in a world of hurt, and I had to go and see someone. I was completely messed up.
Do you think him saying that was part of what precipitated that, or it would have happened at the same time anyways?
Look, I think it sort of there was a lot that sort of fed into the whole picture then. Look, I was already really broken at the point he said that. When it was actually in jail, I went in to see him in jail about some stuff, and look, the conversation went on longer than what we probably thought it would, because he was not surrounded by people who could give him good, intelligent conversation. So he was pretty happy I was there. But look, it was only 2 weeks later, and I was basically not sleeping at all by then. I was lying awake at night, just full-blown panic attacks all night, and not sleeping at all, and then it was just one night I came home I went back to see a psychologist again, and this time I got a psychologist that was really good and really trauma informed, which is so important that you get someone who's a good fit and understands. She told me some things that I knew were true, but I still wasn't ready to accept it. But I went home and I was telling my wife about that appointment while I was cooking dinner, and normal conversation suddenly turned into complete collapse. And I was bawling my eyes out so hard I could not breathe. That's how hard I was crying, and I'd never done that for 25 years. And then from there on in, I was just completely broken. It was a good solid 3-year battle to get to the point where I started to make a change, and then another 2 years after that to get myself back to the point of recovery, which is pretty important as well. But that's what this all comes down to here. It's like all three of us had to hit rock bottom, and sometimes you actually need to hit the bottom of the tank before you start looking up to look for the sunshine.
Yeah, thank you. Gregory, in your book, you describe a chart that you drew while living in the forest. It had just 4 horizontal lines. Top line represented happiness, the bottom depression. And when you charted your emotional state, it zigzagged kind of chaotically between euphoria at the top and despondency at the bottom. What did conceptualizing that chart teach you?
If you get stoned, you hit the top. But at the same time, there's always that withdrawal, and you crash. So it just spikes. You go up, you go down, you go up, you go down. And I'm sitting there one day, and I'm trying to understand my emotions. Why am I like this? And I drew that chart, and it started off just 2 lines, and that was depression, that was euphoria, and they were the only 2 emotions that I really understood. And we talk about alcohol and drugs, and that's, for me, that was just killing the pain, because there was so much emotional pain that I couldn't survive without medicating that pain. And every time I medicated that pain, I'd hit the top. There was no moderation there. And then I'd crash again. And I'm sitting there, I'm wondering, what if I drew 2 lines across the middle? And I tried to keep my emotions in those 2 lines, because there's no room. Well, I was using a pretty thick stick to draw it. But and that was really important, actually. Sometimes it's the tools you use that can make the difference, because I was using a thick stick and I couldn't get sharp lines in between the 2 middle lines. And then I remembered when I was in hospital once, I'd had a car accident and crushed my chest, and I spent 3 months in intensive care watching this oscillator going around, and that's what it reminded me of. It was like, that's life. That's life. It shouldn't be like that. And so I forgot all about that until after I lost that argument, and sometime after I made that decision. And it was, after I made that decision, and I sort of put some distance between myself and that last drug and alcohol, that I started reflecting on what I'd learned in the forest. And what I realised is, during all that trauma analysis, I had processed so much that what I needed to know was actually buried inside all that stuff. And I just needed to separate that trauma from those valuable lessons and start to apply that to who I was on that day, understanding that I was never going to always be that same person that I was on that day. As days progressed, I was going to grow more and getting into that elastoplasticity. Because when I came out of the forest, you could tell me 2 numbers and then ask me what day it was, and I wouldn't know what day it was, and then ask me what those 2 numbers were. You said I couldn't remember that. I could not remember. Today I've got to remember 150 students' names, their numbers, and a whole lot of other things. And I don't have a problem doing that. New pathways.
Yeah, you've rebuilt your brain, and now you've got a PhD and teach at university. It's honestly incredible. Now, very quickly, we're going to open it to audience questions. I'm sure you have got some questions for these speakers. But so very quickly, just one more. I've got one more question for each of you. Ben, part of the abyss your brain sunk into, we haven't really gotten into this, but you experienced a lot of existential dread. What would you go back and tell yourself now with what you know about your life at this point?
I don't think I'd be able to tell myself anything, to tell you the truth. I think at the time, I had these experiences of existential dread because I felt that I was sort of unmoored from the continuity of life, and I kept thinking about things from an unuseful scale. So, you know, in 100,000 years' time, there will be no memory of me. 100,000 years before me, obviously, there was no thought of me. And I'm like, and that time scale is relatively truncated in the context of the universe. So I was completely disconnected from that. And I tried to think my way out of that situation, you know. So I'd be like, well, you know, how can we think about things differently? But the thinking didn't actually help, because I had thought my way into the problem and I thought that thinking was the way to get out, but that wasn't the way to get out. I mean, but if I told myself that, then that's just another thought, you know, that wouldn't have been useful anyway.
But in terms of telling yourself, you know, what you've since achieved in your life, that you were able to go on and do meaningful things in your life, that wouldn't have helped?
No,
Interesting.
I wouldn't have cared. But the problem was, I mean, the thing that ended up being really useful for me as a writer was what I was doing in that time and with that experience was that I was trying to identify where the center of the experiential self is. You know, is it in this moment? Is it in our memories? Is it in the things that we're about to do? Is it in, you know, the way that people feel about us? You know, is that the experiential center of the self? And so I needed to have that to be able to relate to the people that I was going to be writing about later on and have the authentic experiences that were going to be in the books that I was going to write later on. But to actually be able to do that, I had to have that sort of long, dark midnight of the soul, I think.
Yeah, right. Okay. Craig, very quickly, what has the process of writing about your experience done for you?
Yeah, I talk a lot about, and I promote writing therapy and journaling. I think it's an amazing thing. I was just listening to Ben talking about how his writing has changed over time. When you wrote earlier, it was quite cynical. I actually, I said something I've strongly advised anyone that's writing a book is make sure you send it away and get it professionally assessed. Right, it's a very important thing to do. I did that with my first manuscript. Now, because I used writing as a way of therapy, like I started pretty much immediately from my first doctor's appointment. I started writing the chronology, and then look at probably the first manuscript was about 5 years of work on and off over time. And when the assessment came back for that first manuscript, some of the criticism was in the language I was using. And when I look back now at how much my writing has changed, it's almost like a timeline of the progression of my recovery. So going back at the start, there's a lot of anger and there's a lot of bitterness and there's a lot of judgment, like a lot of judgmental language I was using about other people, particularly criminals and drug addicts and those sorts of things. And then over time, that anger and that judgment started to diffuse a little bit and started to soften. And I think that's the key thing with writing as a therapy. I've just written a second book. It's coming out in September, and it's even that has given me a chance to really reflect on a lot of opinions and judgments and thoughts and beliefs that I've now changed through that process. Because talking therapy, that's great, but I reckon only goes skin deep. When you write about your experiences, it really forces you to dig in deep, and then you write it out, whatever your beliefs and experiences are. And like Ben was saying before, you read over it and you go, well, that's not quite the way I feel. So you go back and explore it more and more and more until you get it down pat. And it really gives you a chance to prize your life right open and to explore it and put to bed a lot of those experiences as well and to process them.
Fantastic, thank you. Last question from me before we open it up. Gregory, tell us about your relationship with your inner child.
Yeah, that's a really important relationship. A really important relationship. Basically, when I was a child, I was I was abused quite severely by everybody that was supposed to be looking after me. When I sat down and started to, the inner child is really big. Because it relates to your parents, it relates to yourself, it relates to every relationship that you will ever have. It relates to your children. I was sitting there one day and I'm sort of reflecting, and I realised there's this pain living inside of me. I'd done a lot of work. I'd really changed a lot in my life. and I was going to university. I was still living in sand dunes, but I was doing okay. In my world, I was doing pretty good, but there was still this deep pain, and that pain and suffering. When I looked and asked myself, what was it? It was my child screaming out inside, saying, "Yes, you've got this great life. You're heading in good directions, but you've never shown me love. You've never acknowledged who I am." And I needed to acknowledge the pain that my child had gone through, and I needed to become a parent and take responsibility and assure that child that I would be there for him wherever I could be, whenever I could be. One thing I did learn is I don't make promises to that child. All I do is the best I can every day. And I acknowledge that child every day. And in acknowledging that child, I can be a better dad to my child. I can be a better husband to my wife. I can be a better friend to my friends. And more importantly, I can allow that child to teach me how to be a good friend, because I never knew how to be a friend.
Wonderful, thank you. All right. I'm sure there are questions in the audience. While we're waiting, there's 2 roving mics if you want to put your hand up, and we will get a... Oh, there's a question right here. Fantastic, thank you. And here first, and then... Oh, actually, you're right there. Let's do there first, but then you're up next. Thank you.
Thank you for a wonderful session. Craig's talked a lot about the role of professional therapists in his life, but we really didn't hear from Ben and Greg about whether that helped them at all.
No, you go first.
Never had time for a professional therapist. I was too busy trying to fix myself. Well, I went, okay. I completed my undergrad degree and I was offered a job at the university. And I didn't even apply for a job, which was kind of weird. I mean, all my life I couldn't get a proper job. But one of the conditions of that was that I continued to study. And I had to do an honours degree. When I looked at what am I going to do an honours degree on, I decided to do an honours degree on people that had similar experiences in my childhood. We talk about existentialism, phenomenology, things like that. So I used these theories to explore these traumas in these people. One of the conditions of the ethics committee for the university was that I be assessed by a professional psychologist. When I went to the professional psychologist, and she was quite a renowned psychologist, she said, do you mind if I write away about you? Because I think we'd like to do some research into your mind. I said, well, what about? And she said, you have an amazing propensity for neuroelasticity. That's the first time I'd ever heard the term, but apparently I could do things that other, and it comes down to trauma. A lot of times it just comes down to that trauma. So, no, I did, but no.
Well, that's interesting, you talking about the fact that your brain has to build a capacity for adaptability because that was going to be a survival mechanism for you, and then it was never turned off. It's fascinating. The only help that, I mean, I have had help a few times through the problems of existentialism that I've felt through my life, but the most significant one that I write about in the book, there was a time where I was in a psychiatric hospital and they were trying to help me, and to no avail. And then this professor came and he started talking to me about Sartre, and I was a teenager at the time, And I didn't know anything about Sartre, but I sort of lied and said, yeah, of course I know who that is. And then he said, you know, you think you're having the same thoughts as him? You think he spends all day in bed? It was spent all day in bed, you know? You think you don't do something with your life? And I was like, no. And he said, you know, you have the whole world ahead of you, and there's an adventure in every single aspect of life. In just the drinking of wine, there is a life's worth of adventure in that. You know, the gradations of taste and things like that. And then the thing that I took away from that was that there are some things that are embedded in life which are not necessarily, even though they're terrifying and even though they're difficult, they are just part and parcel of what it is being human, and you are going to be reconciling with that for the rest of your life. And it's something that I wrote about later when I was writing about soldiers in Afghanistan. There were, I was working with the Special Forces, and there was a lot of guys who had PTSD. And then there was a lot of guys who presented with PTSD but actually didn't have PTSD, they had moral traumas. This is something I really understood when one of the guys I was working with took his own life, and then they did a coronial inquest, and I sat in on the inquest. And his psychiatrist said the injury that he had was solely a moral injury. And they said he never would have gotten better from this moral injury. You know, there were coping mechanisms, there were ways that his life would have been easier, but a moral injury is just embedded in the experience of what it is to be human and having done the things that he's done. And when I saw that, I was like, oh God, that makes so much sense to me, because there are some things that are just difficult, and sometimes your life can be derailed, and there is no solution to it. You know, you can make, you know, the symptoms can be lessened, but there is no actual solution to the core of it, and you just have to keep moving on with those coping mechanisms.
Thank you. Question here.
You partially asked the question, Ashley, but Craig, I wanted to know, because it probably wasn't in your path to write a book, but you wrote that book and now you're going to write another one. So the process of the therapy to writing and now another book. So I'm just interested in that process.
Yeah, sure. Like I said before, it is a matter of processing a lot of those experiences. But I totally agree with everything Ben just said. For me, and as I said, I'm dealing with like literally hundreds of ex-cops every year, running through programs, etc. And it's all about setting them up to have game plans and a positive plan for the future. But one of the things I always talk about is I don't believe in professing, you know, some sort of cured, seen the light, no longer troubled by my experiences in my life and all. I think that's quite unrealistic. Traumas, they're going to stay with you, especially those really deep ones that cut in deep. They're going to stay, and they're going to have some effect on your life going all the way through, right? But the way I look at it, I try to encourage people we talked about acceptance up here already this afternoon, and I think that's a big thing. It's like not to, you just can't make traumatic experiences go away, but what you can do is you can learn to live with them better. And I think one of the biggest ways you can do that is, I think the three of us up here, is turning those negative experiences in your life into something positive that helps other people. And that in itself is so cathartic, I can't even put that into words. Like some of the experiences I've had after delivering talks to high school kids, etc. I've talked about a couple of them in the book. It's just like the way that makes you feel, it's almost like that was worth going through every single thing I've been through, because their life's now changed, quite possibly, you know, and that's all it takes.
That's an incredible note to end on. I want to thank all of you for being such a gorgeous audience, first of all. I want to remind you that all of our books are available in the bookshop, and that you can have the chance to meet these writers and have them autograph a book for you. I also want to thank Words on the Waves for putting this incredible panel together. I just think this is, I've done a lot of panels and spoken to a lot of amazing writers, but this has been the most extraordinary experience. And thank all the volunteers who are part of the festival, and then to thank each of you for your incredible books and your incredible generosity today. Thank you.
Thank you.